Good morning. Welcome to the first BusinessWorld Insights online forum on assessing the coronavirus pandemic's impact on the Philippine economy. I'm Willie Reyes, Editor-in-Chief of BusinessWorld, and I will moderate this forum. We're privileged to have with us today 4 experts who will share their insights on the economic conditions that we face in this pandemic. Each one will now give his opening statement. The first speaker is the Assistant Secretary in charge of the Finance Department's Strategy, Economics, and Results Group. He leads a team now working on tax and related reforms. And before this, he was the head of public policy at Ayala Corporation. He is Assistant Secretary Antonio Lambino II. Good morning, Mr. Lambino.
Good morning, Willie, and thank you for the kind introduction. Greetings to my fellow panelists, Dr. Coulibaly, Ambassador Yujuico, of course, and Dr. Chikiamco, and everyone viewing this session this morning. Thank you for the opportunity to share updates on our socioeconomic response to COVID-19 and to have this discussion with representatives from different sectors. I would like to start by saying that for the Duterte administration, the most urgent priority is to save lives and protect communities amid the ongoing pandemic. Our action plan to achieve this is outlined in the economic team's 4-pillar strategy, namely, first, to support vulnerable sectors through emergency support initiatives. Second, to marshal resources to help the Department of Health and our frontline healthcare workers fight COVID-19. Third, to take fiscal and monetary actions to finance emergency and short to medium term initiatives to keep the economy afloat. And fourth, to formulate and implement an economic recovery plan to create jobs and sustain growth. Our strong macroeconomic fundamentals have put us in a good position to respond to this pandemic. We attribute these strengths to the economic and fiscal policy continuity from one administration to the next, and to President Duterte's conservative approach to fiscal and economic policy. Our growth in 2019 in terms of GDP was at 5.9%, a strong figure in comparison with the rest of Asia and the rest of the world. And our annual GDP growth average from 2016 to 2019 was at 6.4%. Our revenue to GDP ratio in 2019 was also the highest in 22 years at 16.9%. Our debt to GDP ratio in 2019 stood at a very manageable 41.5%, way down from the peak in 2004 of 74.4%. Our inflation rate in March 2020 is well within the 2 to 4% target range. We are at 2.5% as of March 2020. There is ample room in our overall financial position to absorb additional borrowings. Partners have been extending concessional terms such as the World Bank, the Asian Development Bank, the AIIB, and other development partners. And the bond market has been responding very positively to our offerings, even during this pandemic, given our very strong financial and economic position prior to the pandemic. The economic recovery team is now crafting our short to medium term bounce back plan so that we can get back to our growth trajectory. And more importantly, get the Filipino people back to work. Thank you.
Thank you for that situationer, Asek Lambino. The next panelist is the World Bank's lead economist and program leader at the World Bank for Brunei, Malaysia, the Philippines, and Thailand. Souleymane Coulibaly. He has been in the country since February last year, and before that, he was in charge of Central African economies. Good morning, Dr. Coulibaly.
Good morning, Willie. It's my pleasure to be attending this forum online. So let me start by saying that this COVID-19 crisis is first a health shock to the economy. So it's a supply shock in this sense to economies around the world, including in the Philippines. A supply shock because labor supply is constrained by direct health impact, people getting sick, some dying, and indirect health impact with self-quarantine or time taken to care for family members. It's a supply shock also because measures adopted to suppress or contain the propagation of the virus like the travel bans, social distancing, lockdowns, affect the production of some sectors directly, like the transportation sector, the tourism sector, mass entertainment, or indirectly also if the sectors are deemed non-essential, like manufacturing of products that are sold in malls, restoration, a wide range of other services. So the immediate impact of this supply shock is an income shortfall for workers and entrepreneurs that can turn into an aggregate demand shock if the measures are harsher and longer in terms of the time it takes. In the case of the Philippines, where a loosened-wise wide enhanced community quarantine was adopted since mid-March, it means that 70% of the national economy is directly affected by this combined supply and demand shock. The government effort to provide income to the poor and vulnerable for 2 months and secure firms access to liquidity through the Bayanihan to Heal as One Act is important for cushioning the economic impact of the lockdown. But the health crisis might take longer to be fully under control. And the government might not have the fiscal space to cover the income shortfall over a longer period. The longer it takes to address the health crisis, the deeper the combined supply and demand shocks might be, with the additional risk of the stability of the financial sector weakening, which could trigger a second round of supply shock, followed by a much larger demand shock fueled by precautionary saving, for instance, by consumers, and weaker investment confidence. On the other hand, the COVID-19 pandemic might also accelerate the move of the Philippine economy to digitalization, which would in turn improve the aggregate productivity of the economy over the medium term. The current crisis is also helping the country to strengthen its health and social protection systems, which, together with an improved education system and business environment, fully leveraging new technologies, are poised to accelerate growth over the medium to long term. So we have the short-term crisis challenge, which is a health crisis, which is translating itself first as a supply shock, but also we have over the long term an opportunity to strengthen the economy, and the World Bank stands to work with Philippine and its other counterparts around the world to really leverage this crisis over the medium term. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Dr. Coulibaly. Next, we have the President of the Philippine Chamber of Commerce and Industry, who had served as Special Envoy for the President for Trade Relations with Eastern Europe, Ambassador Benedicto Yujuico. Good morning,
Hi.
Ambassador.
Good morning. Good morning, Willie. Good morning, ASEC Tony. Good morning, Dr. Sue Coulibaly. Good morning, Mr. Calixto Chikiamco. Before I give my short opening remarks, I was elected president of PCCI effective January, and now I'm in the middle of a big fight against COVID. I said, maybe this is not a lucky time to be president of PCCI. I'm just joking. I'm happy to serve. I'm happy to be part of the team that will help the Philippines overcome this difficulty. The COVID-19 pandemic has crippled the world economy, including our country. We are in the brink of a major recession. Our local businesses, large or small, are struggling to survive. Businesses are forced to explore all possibilities to overcome this unprecedented crisis. Due to quarantine regulations, certain industries have been affected more than others. Businesses involved in the essential goods and services sector are, for the most part, operational. The non-essential businesses remain closed. With the government now issuing partial reopening guidelines, existing businesses will now have to plan and implement their reopening strategy to be sufficient to address the variables presented by the COVID. Like, for example, we have to make sure that we are able to maintain safety standards, like safe distancing, masks, etc. As the primary organization that is fully dedicated to supporting the growth of the development of micro, small, and medium-sized enterprises, PCCI is closely following how the pandemic is affecting MSMEs, with a particular focus on those small businesses in the localities. In various forums with our members, their biggest struggles with a slowdown in market demand is the increasing cost of raw materials and intermediate goods. This is particularly true for members who trading with countries that are greatly impacted by the COVID-19 pandemic, such as China, United States, and Japan. Now, for both members, large and small, catering to the domestic market and international market, losses are attributed to the imposition of travel restrictions that caused late shipments, canceled orders, loss of suppliers and buyers. Newfound difficulties include complications in obtaining loans, delays in remittances of payments, cancellations of credit lines, and of course, excess manpower. What small firms are expecting out of an intervention from the government are drastic measures concerning financial assistance. As the health crisis is altering economies, in the short term, our members are requesting support in the forms of tax breaks and loan assistance and a review of processes to accelerate the movement of goods. Thank you.
Thank you, Ambassador Yujuico, and I'm sure we all wish you well in your baptism of fire. Our fourth speaker is the President of the Foundation for Economic Freedom and is himself a columnist of BusinessWorld. Mr. Calixto Chikiamco. He authored a book, The Way Forward, The Path to Inclusive Growth, that was published in 2016, and he co-authored another book titled Momentum, Economic Reforms for Sustaining Growth. Good morning, Mr. Chikiamco.
Good morning, Willie. Good morning to my fellow panelists. The administration is projecting flat to slightly less than 1% growth of the Philippine economy. I think that's even optimistic, given the many negative external and internal factors and the government's very hard lockdown, one of the most stringent in the world, with banning of mass public transport, and the slow motion approach it is taking to opening up the economy. We probably will have a vast wasteland, no animal spirits, much weaker banks, and a vast number of unemployed after this crisis. Aggravating the crisis are the weakness of our institutions in the processes in implementing a strategy to counter the effects of this crisis. For example, without a national ID, the DSWD has been struggling to distribute the social amelioration funds for 18 million households. The website of the Social Security System for the Small Business Wage Subsidy Program keeps crashing. Fiscal stimuli is useless if the institutions aren't capable of delivering it. In sum, the economic damage will be severe. If the virus spread is exponential, the economic damage will also be exponential as the lockdown and restrictions drag on. Recovery will be long and uncertain. If we do not make structural reforms as a result of this crisis, the painful experience we underwent would have gone for nothing. Thank you.
Thank you for your views, Mr. Chikiamco. Let's now proceed with discussions. Various Philippine economic forecasts by the government, think tanks, multilateral organizations like the World Bank and bank economists, they are all increasingly putting 2020 growth projections at slight contraction to near flat growth at the very best. And some of our own economic managers like Finance Secretary Dominguez and Central Bank Governor Jokno have chimed in on their own personal forecasts. My first question is to ASEC Lambino. When will economic managers of the DBCC, the Development Budget Coordination Committee, meet to finalize new official macro assumptions? And what has been the growing consensus, if any, on GDP growth this year and in 2021?
Yeah, thank you for that, Willie. The DBCC, of course, is continually coordinating on these decisions that need to be made. And let me just highlight that as Secretary Dominguez has emphasized, and partly in response to what Dr. Chikiamco shared earlier, the decisions that we are faced with, and ultimately the president has to make, are not only economic. They are ethical and moral. And actually, weeks ago, there were certain business groups that shared their position papers on wanting an accelerated opening up. The secretary asked for estimates of the trade-offs between the economic side of the equation and the health and the well-being side of the equation of our citizens. And it's not a black or white trade-off that we're talking about. It's livelihoods and lives that we're talking about. And even with that urging, and despite having the resources to do this type of analysis, having access to actuaries and economists and the like, the private sector never provided this type of analysis. So we did it ourselves, and that analysis has been made available to the IATF. It's not just about the economic slowdown. It's also about how many people will get infected as we open up, slowly, in a moderate way, or in a quick way. How many people will die after being infected? What is the mortality rate? What is the estimates? What are our estimates given various scenarios? And that was requested and was never forthcoming. So we have done that work, and that is guiding the decision-making process of the IATF. Now, with regard to the economy itself, everything now depends on how long the ECQ is needed in order to save lives and to protect our communities. How fast global demand will bounce back as well. The implementation of the lockdown has indeed slowed down private consumption, a large contributor to GDP, to our GDP growth. We might also see some increase in the unemployment figures. Around 1.2 million is our most recent estimate in the short run, given the slowing down of private consumption. If some areas are downgraded to general community quarantine, subject to certain conditions, such as minimum health standards being met, such as being able to protect people through social distancing on public transportation, options, then we might see private consumption to start increasing for the remainder of the year. On the infrastructure side, public spending on infra is also delayed for the first half of the year. However, in 2019, it was able to bounce back immediately. For us this year, it would depend on how many areas will have to stay under ECQ under the conditions I just talked about, and how government will be able to reallocate resources. That said, infrastructure is certainly a priority. It has massive multiplier effects. And of course, our social investments, especially in the healthcare sector. So a couple of notes on the subsidies that the government launched immediately under Pillar 1 of its socioeconomic strategy. The DSWD has implemented new guidelines requiring local governments to release funds to beneficiaries within 24 hours of receipt those funds. Also, it's I guess important to note that because of the 4-piece program, partially supported by the World Bank and implemented by DSWD, 3.7 million households or families were able to receive their subsidy right away. In terms of the small business wage subsidy, actually, we're still in our application phase. And while the SSS website did experience a number of issues and crashes, there were alternate application methods that were made available through cloud-based secure options, email-based, and also website-based. And these are ongoing and have been up and running for the past few days. And now we have more than around 1 million beneficiaries that have been validated out of the 3.4 million total beneficiaries. And in fact, the payouts will probably start earlier than the scheduled May 1 release. Now, so there are many things that are ongoing. At the same time, we have to continue funding our fight against COVID-19 led by the health department. We need to raise resources such as those from the Asian Development Bank, AIIB, and the World Bank, represented by Dr. Su in this forum. Around 5.7 billion US dollars are expected to come online by the end of this month, in a few days. And additional liquidity has been pumped into the economy by monetary actions by the Bangko Sentral ng Pilipinas, such as the lowering of the RRR by 200 basis points, around 200 billion pesos of additional liquidity. For the small businesses, additional programs are about to be launched. A 120 billion worth of loans to be guaranteed under Phil Guarantee, and a legislative effort to extend the NOLCO from 3 to 5 years for losses incurred in 2020. So those are some of the things that are being done. The DBCC is constantly monitoring the situation, and these policy decisions will be recommended to the President very soon. Thank you. Thank you.
Willie, this is
yes,
Benedicto Yujuico. Can I ask a question or make a
Definitely.
comment?
yes, please.
Okay. I was watching a, a interview of the Federal Reserve Chairman in the U.S. And the comment was there is not amount of money that can be thrown into the U.S. economy to restart it. They were commenting this because they were talking of $4 trillion that they would prepare to restart the U.S. economy. They are very, very concerned that there are 26 million unemployed. And so they are trying to develop all kinds of fiscal and monetary stimulus to restart it. But the comment was there's not amount of money that can be thrown at the economy to restart it, which is, they mean is, we need business to start. Without business restarting, you cannot throw enough to restart it. So with this in mind, I am observing that in more advanced countries like America, there is now great debate whether to restart business or not. Georgia went #1. Okay, they are starting. California is more conservative. But there is a general awareness that business has to start pretty soon. Spain, Italy, and Germany. Germany is a very responsible country with responsible leaders. What are they doing? They are restarting. Now, these countries are very rich. They can support social amelioration programs longer, I think, than Philippines or even other developing economies. But what they are doing today is focusing on restarting economies, and that is what we hope in the business sector will be allowed by the government. Now, I just want to say that we are supportive of government. We will follow the guidelines that are issued by the government. I'm just making a comment that my observations of what the other countries are doing, and I'm just sharing it to our viewers.
Can I come in?
Yes, please,
Yeah,
Dr.
quickly maybe to reflect on what Ambassador just said, and before him, Asek Tony. I think the point I wanted to push to at least to flag is we are facing first a supply shock because of the health nature of the initial crisis, and then this has led to a demand shock. So because of this particular nature of the crisis, that is not the same as the crisis we had before. In 2008, it was a financial sector crisis that started the problem. And in other years, it was, for instance, the oil shocks that created the problem. Here we have a health shock that is creating a supply shock. So unless this health challenges is under control, and the signal from the population at large, for consumer at large, is that things are under control, it will be really difficult to have a very effective resumption of economic activities. So this is a point I wanted to flag. It's true that the economy should be driven by the private sector, by businesses, but businesses are not existing alone. Consumers need to be buying. Consumers need to be making decisions. And if we focus even on the middle class, not the daily earners who need to go out to earn something, if we look at the middle class, they will be making decision on is it safe for me to go to entertainment, to go to this kind of goods that I can postpone if it's not necessary. And because of this decision of consumers, even if business want to open, it will really be difficult to have a thriving economy. So I think the priority is really to have a health situation under control. And I think the government has been effective with the ECQ. A few of the developing countries have been as tough as the Philippines to put these measures. Now, let's hope that we'll see quickly that the epidemic is under control, and then consumer will start making decisions. Business will start making decisions informed by the fact that the government is really, really on top of the health crisis. And then everything else will go on. For instance, consumption is a main driver for growth. It's meant that as soon as consumers decide to behave normally, the economy will slowly go back to where it was before the crisis. So I want to stop here.
Thank you, Doctor. Yes, Mr. Chikiamco.
Well, I disagree with my friend Sue that it is primarily, let's say, consumer behavior that will drive, the economy. because I talked about this, in a article about the doom loop. Because once firms start laying off, of course, this will also lead to lower demand. And lower demand in turn will lead to businesses further closing and unemployment. So it's both, actually. As I said, there's change in consumer behavior because of the health crisis, but there's also an income effect. The many people are just don't have an income, especially those who are on no work, no pay basis. And then, of course, you have a lot of maybe thousands of OFWs who have lost jobs. And consumer spending is, of course, a large part of our economy. So that will suffer a blow.
Yes, thank you, Mr. Chikiamco. Before we go to
may I add a comment also? I think
Yes,
it's also
please.
important again to re-emphasize the question that Secretary Dominguez posed to a number of business groups and associations. What is the trade-off in terms of livelihoods, lives, and the ability of people to stay healthy, and the ability versus the ability of people to put food on the table, right? And how do we balance those concerns? And again, the private sector is more than capable of doing that analysis. And when requested, it just never came. So that's something that we need to, that's what we need to grapple with in terms of policy decision making. It is not a purely economic decision. It is ethical, moral. It has to be driven by science. It has to be informed by epidemiology, data science, economics, etc. And the United States was raised as an example. News reports have illustrated that the coronavirus has killed more Americans than the Vietnam War did. So again, please consider what is our threshold? What is our moral and ethical compass telling us in terms of our willingness to see infections rise and the death and the mortality rate kick in, based on the number of those infections? As we know, around 2% of infections end up in death. So what we're proposing is a calibrated, a purposeful reopening of the economy, given, again, what I mentioned earlier. First, are locations able to meet minimal health standards that will protect the people? Second, are public transportation options being set up in ways that will allow for social distancing? Third, what are the population factors in terms of risks to infection and mortality? So, for instance, what age groups are most vulnerable? We know that younger age groups, 20 and below, tend to spread the virus more to the most vulnerable age group, the senior citizens. Most of the deaths are from the groups 50 years old and above. What businesses are essential to the revival of certain parts of our economy, and which workers will be able to come in under what conditions? So all of these things need to come into play as the policy decisions are made. And I would like to again emphasize that question, because it was asked and no answer was forthcoming, which is why Secretary Dominguez formed a team that looked into that. And those analyses are guiding the decision-making process. Thank you.
Thank you, Asek. I'm sure we appreciate the difficult balancing act in policymaking right now. Mr. Chikiamco, can you just tell us, you were talking about the doom loop, but do you see that risk? Are we on the verge of such a risk?
Pardon?
The doom loop
Yes,
that you
yes.
wrote about. Are we on the verge of such a risk?
Oh yeah, yeah. I think so. A lot of I don't know. Ambassador Yujuico can many MSMEs which provide the majority of employment uh, uh, here. I think they can do with maybe 1 month of stoppage, but I think on 2 months they're already out of working capital and I think facing bankruptcy. That is my view. That so that is what I'm referring to as the doom loop.
Yeah.
You know, so and well, I don't want to quarrel with my friend Tony about the ethical. I'm sure everybody is understands that there's uh, a balancing act that we have to do. So, although I have to point out that Vietnam has no deaths, it's only 270 cases, and they have already started opening up. But anyway, I think though that what we have to focus on is how to restart the economy, given of course this reality that the virus will be with us. Is how do we restart the economy? Uh, Sue said that we cannot start until the health thing is fixed. No, but I think we can. And especially I think the crisis has shown that food production is very important, and I think government policy should be oriented toward improving food production.
Thank you, sir.
Can I quickly follow up,
Yes,
Willie?
please, Doctor,
Yeah,
yes.
so I didn't say that the economy cannot restart unless the health crisis is addressed. I said under control, which means that at least it's possible for the health system to track, to see where people are being contaminated and how to contain this contamination. It doesn't mean that we have zero contamination, but it means that the system is now sound enough to control, and the disease become like a regular disease where we have a surveillance system in place. And the 2 months of the lockdown, I think, has been helpful to at least collect enough information. So I'm assuming that the government will take some decision to slowly move back to normal, not drastically, not immediately, but slowly, as they implement some of the information they collected during these two lockdown months. Now, the challenge is the medium to long term. Because if the crisis is still there, if we have second round infection in China, in the rest of Europe, around the world, we'll have a demand shock that will be stronger now on the external side. And then this, even if Philippines is controlling everything, this might have a second wave effect on the domestic economy. So there are a lot of uncertainty related to this particular disease, but if the right measures are taken to have the health crisis under control, again, I'm not saying totally stopping the infection, but under control, then decision will be made by consumers, but by investors, on an individual basis, because they realize that, the economy is sound, the measures are sound, and they take also their own share by investing, by consuming, by taking some risk by going out. But this need to be informed by how strong and how convincing the government measures have been. And I think so far, my own assessment looking at other developing countries, is Philippines has been doing the right thing so far.
Yes. Well, your own report earlier this month said that the ultimate solution is a vaccine, and that will come in 18 months at best,
Okay, well,
actually. But then it will take not
I lost audio
18
here.
months and then another 6 months to spread it throughout the world. So that's like 2 years, right? So is that going to be the situation that we're facing? Because a number of economists, both in government and private sector, are saying hopefully we'll have some rebound in the fourth quarter and next year. But with that kind of scenario on the vaccine, apparently in the next 2 years, we're going to see very muted economic activity.
This is the reality of the crisis. I think this is a particularity of this crisis compared to many others. Because as I said, in 2008, we had a financial crisis that triggered all the spillover effects. In the 75, for instance, we had an oil shock that created. So we it's a very specific shock this time around because of the health nature of the crisis, and this is what is making it maybe one of the major crises since the Great Depression in the 30s. So we need to acknowledge that this is a major crisis. Some countries will be hit much more than others. And one of the particularities also the largest economies are really hard hit. China, the US, Germany, all of these manufacturing households in the world are affected. So the spillover effect in many other economies, even if these individual economies are doing the right thing, will be large. So we need to acknowledge that this is a major crisis. It can be there for a while. And, governments need to handle this crisis the right way. First, by having the health crisis under control, and then seeing how to protect the most vulnerable part of the population. Now, if it takes longer, we will have a fiscal challenge because government cannot continue to borrow, to provide for daily income earners. So it will be a real challenge. But we are not there yet. So let's assume that at least the health crisis will be under control quickly so that it gives a signal to consumers and investors that everything is under control, even if we still have some risk, and they start to get involved through the spending, through the decision of investing, and then we will contain the crisis. It will not be the 6% growth like Tony mentioned, but maybe it will be 0 this year or even -1 or 2 this year. But next year, slowly, we will see some resumption of the economy.
0 to -1, because
can I say
earlier
something? Can you hear?
Ambassador, yes, please. Yes, please. Just on the side, Dr. Coulibaly, earlier this month, your report put projected growth at negative 0.5 to 3%, and now everyone's saying that's too optimistic now. So now you're saying that it's. Can you mention that the new projection again?
We are working on our new projection. So we will be issuing our Philippine economic update in June. So we used to be issuing it in October and April. This year, we decided to issue it in June and in January. So our upcoming economic update will revise our estimation. It will definitely be downward because by the time we were providing the numbers in April, the health situation was not as bad as what we have now. So we have now this information. We'll have the Philippine Statistical Agency numbers next week or so. So we'll factor all this. So you will have in the public domain in June our Philippine economic update that will provide our current estimation. It will be lower than what we have, definitely. I can't put numbers yet because we need to do the calculation. My team is ready to work on that. We are just waiting for the first quarter data. But we are also looking on the medium term, and one of the special topic of this economic update will be the digital economy, how it's an opportunity right now to leverage not only the government work, but also the private sector, the schooling, so that the productivity over the medium term also is improved. So let's not forget that there is also a positive element to this crisis that can be leveraged through digitalization of the economy.
Thank you, Dr. Ambassador, the government has already eased containment restrictions in a lot of provinces. Of course, for Metro Manila, they have extended it for 2 weeks, but all the rest, they have eased that. I get from your comments that even that does not sit well with some businessmen. Is that true? Mr. Ambassador? Mr. Chikiamco, maybe I'll go first to you. Could you just share with us your views on what you see have been the emerging lessons so far with this crisis? Well, because I noticed, for instance, everyone's now talking about the national ID system, but that's been in the pipeline for 20 years. Everyone has now we have this so-called Balik Provincia program that they're preparing. But I remember during the Ramos administration, when I covered the president then, he had already raised that, and we have to push opportunities to the countryside. And then, can you just talk about the lessons so far from this crisis?
Well, as I said, some of the lessons that we can take off is that first of all, I think we really, for example, even Senator Bongo has said that we should have a Balik Provincia program, right? But in order for that to be successful, there should be jobs in the countryside, and I think that's what I think the government has to do, is to make investing in the countryside attractive. So that's why in one of my columns to BusinessWorld, I said that the government should look into mining, forestry, and agriculture. So those are the things that we should really focus on. If we want really for people to move to the countryside and to or at least to the second-tier cities, so as to decongest Metro Manila. So it cannot be business as usual. We have to make really reforms, structural reforms. Otherwise, so it's taken about digitalization, but if our internet is not available to a lot of our people, that will not happen. So we have to make broadband access affordable with better quality. So we need to liberalize, I think, the economy, if possible, to lift the foreign ownership restrictions in the Constitution, so that we could probably have better public utility, public services.
So apparently,
Willie, Willie, can I interrupt? Can you?
Yes,
you hear?
yes, Ambassador. I just
sorry.
have a question before for you.
I kind of lost audio, so sorry.
Right. So you're okay now.
I lost audio, so now I'm back. Okay, thanks.
The government just a few days ago lifted the containment restrictions in most of the country except for the National Capital Region and some areas. That's I see that as a result of its very delicate balancing act. But I get from your comments that even this does not sit very well with some businesses. Do you confirm that?
Were you asking me that?
Yes. The business, the view from the ground.
It's not really a matter of sitting well with some business, but businessmen always ask questions. And for example, they say, well, if you want to provide employment and if we have budget for, say, public works, why don't we fix the streets now when there's no traffic? Questions like this. If in fact the idea is not to have any contamination problems, when people work in the streets, they are at least 6 feet or at least 12 feet or even further away. Some business people are also asking, well, we have infrastructure projects. Well, why don't we actually restart this to actually provide money flowing into the economy so that people can actually start buying the necessary food and medicine and so on and so forth. It's just a matter of the private sector asking questions as to, well, why can't we do this when in fact we are able to do, say, public works, fixing the streets, and not have to risk contamination. Really, that's kind of the question that they're asking. Not so much questioning whether we should do it or not, but really saying there must be some other way. For example, I just want to mention that in Germany, Volkswagen actually restarted or started to open up their plants again. They are not waiting whether consumers will buy their products or not. I think the responsible way for Volkswagen to do is actually, okay, fine, let's restart this, because if we don't start it, I mean, where will we start this restarting of the economy? So big companies can do that, and so same principle with small companies. Let's take the case of a restaurant, a small restaurant at that. maybe with capacity of 100 people. They realize that if they reopen, they cannot reopen with 100% capacity. They realize that they will probably open with 50% capacity and with additional costs because they will have to provide masks, they have to provide gloves, and they will have to change the menu all the time. But they need to try because they know that that the vaccine or cure, there's no certainty as to, oh, it's coming next month or month after or whatever. So not knowing exactly when the uncertainty will end, they will have to try something. And this is what the private sector, particularly the small and medium scale enterprises, they want to try as long as it is consistent with government policy because we're not going to have a vaccine next month or 2 months later. And they know that they cannot survive another 2 or 3 months. They know that they cannot receive or will not be receiving further assistance from the government. So they just want to try and try as early as possible. That's it. That's what I wanted to add.
Well, yes.
Really, can I just comment that I agree with the ambassador? I think we can trust the private sector to behave responsibly and especially they want to protect their own workers. And also make sure that they do not endanger their customers. That is the reason why, for example, I think the private sector has taken the initiative in mass testing. I think Joey Concepcion has led this effort because they are concerned, of course, for their own people, which is really the most important resource that they have. And therefore, that they will do the responsible thing and do tests so that they do not infect the others, and also apply risk mitigation measures from requiring masks, doing some social distancing, putting hand sanitizers in the workplace. So
Yes.
I think we can trust the private sector to do these things. And sometimes, it's hard for the government to micromanage. For example, what are essentials? What are essential industries? Say food, agriculture, but you need plastics to package the food. So I would try to trust the private sector more and give them a little bit more leeway.
Thank you, Mr. Chikiamco, Ambassador. Well, as they say, one of the silver linings in this current crisis is that it lays bare whatever has to be fixed, both at the macroeconomic level and among industries and companies. One of the glaring flaws of the system, I think, is the clear incapacity of many local governments to step up. It's disheartening personally to hear the national government saying that, oh, we have already downloaded to local governments all the funds needed for the social amelioration program. But then when you check on the ground, less than half of the targets have received their monies. So my question, Asek Lambino, how does the national government plan to remedy this situation when the clock has been ticking for those households and even the middle income families who suddenly find themselves among the ranks of the poor right now? What is the national government planning to do to improve the situation at the local level, and how fast can it do so?
Yeah, thank you for that question, Willie. It's a very important one. And I touched on some of the responses earlier. Allow me to restate them. First, as I mentioned, for the emergency subsidy program for 18 million families. And by the way, that's 75% of the population of families in the country. The new guidelines have just been released where LGUs have to release within 24 hours of the download of funds. Second, we have improved in terms of the the small business wage subsidy program, previous programs where the processing was done manually. So now it's automated. And because it's automated, the funds can be distributed more quickly directly through bank accounts, PayMaya accounts, or even through remittance services. And as I mentioned, we've done this through not just the website, which had issues for SSS, but also through an email system to a secure cloud-based service, and now through a purely cloud-based service with upload capacity for Excel spreadsheets. So all of these things are being done already. And in addition, the Phil Guarantee, which has consolidated a lot of guarantee programs in the country into something that is more professionally managed, has approved through a board resolution, 120 billion pesos worth of loans that the government will guarantee, especially for small business, because the small businesses were mentioned earlier as the majority of firms in the country. And in fact, they employ a majority of workers in the country. So one of the things that we learned from a survey that was fielded rather quickly while the ECQ was in place and when it was just starting, it had more than 44,000 respondents. What are the pain points that small businesses are feeling? And according to those that had to close down, they needed support with their expenses. So what was done right away? Grace periods for loans with no interest on interest, no additional penalties, no fees. Grace periods for rent, the rental expenses, and now the small business wage subsidy as salary subsidies for their workers. That's what they said they needed help with. Second, for those that had to close down partially, and don't see a quick U-shaped recovery for their business, they need access to credit, which is why the loan guarantee program worth 120 billion pesos in loans was put in place. And lastly, we are also going to work with Congress, and we already have heard from members of both the Senate and the House who want to sponsor this legislation, an extension of the net operating loss carryover from the current 3 years to 5 years for losses incurred in 2020, so that businesses, especially small businesses, can claim losses over 5 years and reduce the tax burden moving forward. So those are some of the things that are being done already. And we will continue, of course, to work on the economic recovery plan informed by what the pain points really are according to our stakeholders. So for the small businesses, as I mentioned, we did a survey and we're targeting our responses based on the felt pain points. We're doing a deeper dive public opinion research with international partners in understanding the pain points of the medium to large enterprises. And so the response of government over the immediate and short term, I've mentioned some of those elements. For the medium to long term, those are being formulated with the data we are gathering from the stakeholders themselves.
Thank you, ASEC.
Tony, Willie, can make another comment here.
Yes, please, Ambassador.
Tony, I think all of the micro, small, and medium-sized enterprises are really, really thankful for the help and the support and all of the things you're doing for them. And on the other hand, they know that this is not a sustainable thing, that they will just look at the Department of Finance and wait for additional funding, additional loans, additional guarantees. So it's after the third month, the fourth month, the fifth month that they are now thinking about. They are worried about, okay, it's not sustainable. They don't want to overburden the government. They are very thankful for the help on the first month, on the second month, and perhaps even the third month. But what about another month or two, since there is no vaccine, there is no proof that this will all go away? So they need to do something for their survival. Is that what the SMEs are telling us, Tony? I just want to explain so that we will understand that it is not that they're not thankful, it's that they're worried. They know that whatever assistance is being given to them is not sustainable, and so they want to be able to help themselves. That is why they want to open as soon as they can, and they want to try. That's all.
Yeah, indeed, Ambassador, that is very well taken, and the economic team is well aware of that and in constant dialogue with these stakeholders, as well as, on the other hand, the medical professionals and the epidemiologists and the data scientists. We're trying to find a way to open up responsibly and in ways that protect lives and livelihoods at the same time. And there is no silver bullet for that. We are going to have to weigh various considerations. That is why there are proposals to open up based on certain guidelines. Again, I mentioned earlier, first, minimum health standards that need to be met in certain locations. The health system should be able to manage the peak of infections that are projected for that area, or else we will overburden the health system and it will collapse. So we need to make sure that the outbreak thresholds in particular areas are taken into account. The infection rate, or what some specialists call the R naught, how many other people does one infected person infect in a given area. And so we have to make sure that that number is below 1, so that we know that we're flattening and dampening the curve at the same time. We also need to make sure that those who are particularly vulnerable to transmitting and to being, mortally affected, those who will die from this infection, be protected. So who will stay at home, who will be allowed to work, those considerations have to be put in place. I mentioned earlier the public transportation system. Will it be able to allow for the distancing that is needed to reduce infections? Comorbidities. We know from the global data that there are certain diseases that increase the likelihood of mortality. So we also have to make sure that we take account of those with, let's say, hypertension, diabetes, and other types of diseases that are comorbid with COVID-19. So again, there is, of course, a desire to get the economy back up and running. We share that desire. I guess what I'm trying to share is we're trying to do it guided by science, guided by research, and guided by our best ethical principles.
Thank you,
I think we know that. Let me just say, this exchange of ideas between Tony, Lambino, and ourselves is not a reflection of a disagreement. In fact, I just want you, Willie, and all our panelists to know that we at PCCI can say, and Tony, I think, will agree, that we work very closely with each other, trying to develop common policies for the good of our country. So
yes,
I
that's
just
right,
wanted to
Ambassador.
make that clear.
Yes. Yeah, we've been partners for many years. Yes, sir.
Yes, thank you. Asek, I'd just like to shift a bit. Clearly, the national government is facing some funding challenges as regards to COVID fight. And just last Friday, Finance Secretary Dominguez said that while there are enough funds for now in the 2020 budget, there are just some funds that the executive cannot readily tap because they have to be realigned. The Congress will be reconvening, I think, next week.
May 4, that's right.
Yeah. Will you be proposing a supplemental budget, and by how much would that be, and for what exactly?
Well, again, it will be informed, the economic recovery plan, which NEDA is leading in putting together with other agencies, will be informed by what the real pain points are. What are small, micro, medium, large businesses really feeling, and what will be meaningful? What will also be meaningful in terms of job creation moving forward? The digital economy was mentioned earlier. That's a very big opportunity. Improving our healthcare system. And again, the backbone of all of that, the infrastructure program, as well as our social investments in health and education will have to transform as well. Now, we know that young people are quite, interactive. They are more prone to spread the virus than others, other age groups, especially with the vulnerable population. So all of these considerations will go into the economic recovery plan. The economic recovery plan will be costed, and that's when we will work with Congress for that. In terms of the emergency response that has been put in place, we have, of course, been working with DBM in the lead to find where the funds can be sourced. The Bayanihan Law provides the president extraordinary but temporary powers over the budget in order to finance these emergency responses. The World Bank, ADB, AIIB, other development partners, because of our very good credit rating, have been willing to lend to us. The Bangko Sentral ng Pilipinas has helped with their monetary actions and providing us with a bond repurchase program worth 300 billion pesos. Now, all of these things have come together for our immediate and short-term responses. But you're right, in terms of the economic recovery plan, from the short to medium term, how we bounce back and make sure that that's a U-shaped recovery and not a W-shaped recovery where we see a second bout of infection. Some of our neighbors in the region tried to open up too quickly. They as Secretary Dominguez said, took their foot off the pedal, and guess what? The infection rate zoomed ahead of them again. So now they're doing a second round of lockdown. There are lessons learned from our immediate neighbors that we need to take into account in making all of this happen in a purposeful and responsible way in terms of opening up our economy again and making sure that we get on a positive growth trajectory that is purposeful, that is responsible, and that puts the best interests of the Filipino people first.
So do you have an amount that you'll be asking for?
It's still being costed, Willie, and that work is ongoing. And there are some specific proposals in the plan, as well as what we're learning from the surveys that we're doing.
Yeah. So let me, yes.
Willie, I just want
Mr. Chikiamco.
to make a point, about because Tony is saying about having science guide our decisions. Our data before were, it's very unreliable, especially when the testing was very few and it was done only on very sick persons. And we really won't know what the situation is without random mass testing. And this is where I think there is talk about the partnership between the government and the private sector. And I think in this direction, I think the businessmen, especially Mr. Joey Consortium and the others, are trying to do some kind of mass testing among their workplaces. So my point only is that the government should really work very closely with the private sector in trying to find a way out of this crisis we have.
Yeah, I just want to highlight something that Dr. Chikiamco mentioned, working together, and that actually is happening. I know of several public-private initiatives, both between the IATF and the private sector, as well as other groups such as DOH and the private sector, in order to ramp up our mass testing. But again, it can't be just any kind of mass testing. Now, it has to be guided by good practices, what we know about this virus. And I just wanted to highlight that because there are so many proposals for different types of mass testing. And we do know that the gold standard, of course, is the PCR test. So that's something that we need to keep in mind as we move forward with these public-private partnerships. Again, in order to reduce our infection rate from above 1, where one person infects more than one person, to below 1, where one person infects over time fewer than one person. I mean, statistically, it sort of works out in terms of flattening and dampening the curve. In order to do that effectively, we would need to be testing at more than double the rate that we're testing today. So yes, those partnerships are critical for moving forward. Also, not just the mass testing, but the contact tracing that needs to go with it. We need to know where to find the cases, and so that we can isolate people who might be vulnerable and might be spreading the virus. So yes, definitely, but it has to be the right kind of mass testing, guided again by the best that we know from the experts in that field.
Right. So it's 12 o'clock. I'd just like to read some comments from some of our audience. From Vlad Santos. A lot of innovations will result from this pandemic because they say that crisis makes the field rich for innovations. And another one from Josel Dohelio. I agree this is an avenue for the economy to go digital. However, not all, especially MSMEs, can shoulder the high cost of doing so. Now let's go to yes. Any
Yeah, well, with respect to digital, I think the government has rightly prioritized the Public Service Act, which would hopefully remove telecoms and transportation from the list of public utilities and enable majority foreign ownership in those critical sectors. In that regard, also, I think Congress is deliberating on a bill. It's the Open Access in Data Transmission Act. Unfortunately, it didn't get passed in the last Congress, but that will enable more players into the broadband space, as you will not need any more a franchise to be able to put up a broadband. So those are the two critical things to make broadband and internet more affordable and more accessible to majority of our Filipinos.
Can I come in?
Yes, please.
Can I come in? Yeah. So I want to make the point that as any crisis, we really, as a team, meaning the government, the private sector, and the donor community, need to take advantage of this crisis to not waste it, because
Yes.
it's an opportunity to do many things in the to strengthen the medium to long-term economic prospect of the country. One, we mentioned the digital economy, definitely. There are other aspects also. I think, for instance, the strengthening of the health system through this crisis is important, because we generally tend to think of the human capital building only, at least generally we focus more on the education part, but maybe a bit less on the health and a bit less on the social protection. But these are very important elements also of building human capital. So with the crisis and the strengthening of the health system and the need to trace, the need to do a good surveillance, the need to know where the vulnerable people are so that the social protection is efficiently going to them is all are very important, because then going out of the crisis, the country will have a stronger health system and also a stronger social protection system. And together with education, that might also bring in some element of digital economy, distance learning, and all these other elements and innovation. This can really strengthen the human capital of the country, and then this will be essential for the medium to long term. Philippines wants to be a middle-income country with people having a decent life by 2040. I think this is a huge opportunity to build on these reforms that are essential to build human capital, to build the digitalization of the economy, to also do some reform for the private sector to be thriving, to attract investors, both domestic and external investors, so that if there are shifts in the global economy, for instance, with a global value chain being disrupted because of this crisis, Philippines can find ways to continue to grow some of these key sectors, maybe partnering with some neighboring countries, with other new partners. But all this will require some reforms to make the domestic economy very attractive. So let's not waste this crisis, take this opportunity to do the right reform, to continue to do the right reform, so that the country has more opportunity to grow in the medium to long term.
Thank you, Doctor. We'll now have parting words from our panelists. We'll start with you, Mr. Chikiamco.
Well, my point only is that I think the government should trust the private sector more. Before, it turned away from PPP and tried to do everything themselves, just like the national ID. But I think the private sector is very much eager to work with the government to not only to do business, but also to help our people improve the health system, etc. Because ultimately, it's all about people. So the health of the people is important. So my points that the government should trust the private sector to behave responsibly, and therefore its plan should factor that in. That's all.
Thank you, Mr. Chikiamco. We'll now go to Ambassador Yujuico, please.
Thank you, Willie. The biggest lesson we can learn from the COVID-19 crisis is that we are at war with an enemy that we cannot see. Each and every Filipino must realize that we have a common enemy to fight, and to win this war, we have to act as one and be united as a nation to achieve a common goal. If we do this, I think we will overcome. Now, aside from the obvious preparation that we need to make sure that our country's health infrastructure, hospitals, clinics, etc., is adequate to meet the needs of universal health care for all, I believe that we should look at the following programs. Number one, we should make sure that there are strong incentives for doctors, nurses, medical technicians, and other health professionals so that they don't need to go abroad to seek opportunities for employment and to follow their dreams. If we have all of these health workers here, we, the Filipinos and the Philippines, will be better able to cope with whatever pandemic it is, whether it's COVID-19 or 20 or 21. The second point that I'd like to emphasize is we need to utilize technology and innovation. We need to implement a national citizen registration system. We need to use artificial intelligence for contact tracing, early hotspot risk detection, border protection for quarantine areas, big data for national monitoring of health statistics, etc. This can also help in disaster management, social amelioration programs, and the like. We do have the young people now in our country that know how to do this. So it is the challenge of private sector and the government to try to find who these people are, utilize their talents, and put them to good work. Thank you very much for the opportunity of being with you this afternoon.
Thank you, sir. Let's have you, Dr. Coulibaly.
Thank you very much, Willie, and my colleague panelists. It has been a very lively and interesting discussion. To me, the big lesson seems to be that the preparedness matters. Preparedness of a health system to quickly have any health crisis under control. The preparedness for business continuity if face-to-face interaction are constrained for whatever reason. Preparedness also for policy, policy preparedness by securing policy space like monetary and fiscal space in sunny days to do the right reform that are needed for the economy to be stronger when we have a crisis like the COVID-19, so that we can also swiftly act in rainy days to protect the poor and vulnerable. By strengthening its preparedness along this dimension, I think the Philippines will be ready for the big shocks that will come in the future. As a long-term partner of the Philippines, the World Bank stands ready to support through its policy advice. We have really scaled up our interaction with our key counterparts, the DOF, the BSP, even the sectoral department, agriculture, the DICT, all the departments. We have had a very intense interaction since the outbreak, and we will continue to provide this policy dialogue, advice, technical assistance through our analytical work, but also through our lending. Since the COVID-19 outbreak, we have lent already for the health system with a 100 million emergency health project. We have done some budget support, 500 million already signed, and we are working on another 500. And we will continue our regular engagement with the government, and we will do our best as a partner, a long-term partner, to be with the government in this crisis and all the stakeholders in the country. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Doctor. Finally, let's have you, Assistant Secretary Lambino.
Thank you, Willie. Thank you to my co-panelists as well as to everyone who's watching right now. It's important to note that at the first sign of local transmission of COVID-19, the President instituted a very quick and decisive response by putting the whole island of Luzon first in under ECQ, and extending this as the curve started to flatten. And we will keep flattening that curve and dampening it so that we protect lives and enable the livelihoods of Filipinos to reflourish. No? But it's also important to note that before the pandemic hit, the Philippine economy was in a very, very good place. We had received a credit rating upgrade just last year to BBB+. We were managing our debts prudently. The tax reform program was instrumental in making sure that our revenue flows were robust. In fact, the best in decades in terms of the performance in 2018 and 2019. In addition, our expenditure program, especially in the infrastructure space, was bringing our expenditure performance to also record highs in 2 or 3 decades. So all of those things came together in order to put us in a good position to make our initial responses toward this pandemic. But as mentioned, there are needs for the short to medium term that the preparation that we have done will not be sufficient for, because the scale of this pandemic is much larger than the regular set of crises that we face every year. So we need to continue our tax reform program to strengthen our ability to give incentives in areas where we need to rekindle growth. We need, as mentioned by the other panelists, to really roll out the national ID system properly. That is one of the marching orders the President gave Acting Secretary Carl Chua, the implementation of the national ID system in as quick possible time. A quick time as possible. And we also need to make sure that the effectiveness of our response in terms of this economic recovery plan depends on the accuracy of our diagnosis. That is why we are trying to understand the needs of the business sector as much as possible as we craft this response plan. Moving forward, this plan, of course, will be implemented still with a focus on our infrastructure program to improve the connectivity backbone, both physical and digital. And we will need to keep investing in our social programs, especially our health system, and also transforming our education system so that it can operate and educate our youth under the new normal that will emerge once we are past the pandemic. So thank you very much, and a good afternoon to everyone.
Thank you, Asek. Actually, suddenly I have a flood of questions, but unfortunately, and we beg your pardon that we cannot field them right now. What we will be doing to those who ask questions is that we will write articles on them. You can read them on our website. We'll ask them of our panelists outside of this forum. And actually, there are a lot of issues that we were planning to take up, but because this discussion is so lively, we couldn't tackle all of them. But that's it for today's Business World Insights. We thank our audience and a big thank you to our guest experts. Join us next week, May 6th, for our second online forum on understanding the new normal for business. Stay healthy till then.